Hi, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Justin with Consordini.com, and in today's kind of mini lesson, we're going to just be discussing the differences between the cello and the upright string bass. Because at first glance, they kind of don't look that different. You look over and you see one group of people sitting up with their instrument, you see another group of people with the instrument leaning against themselves, and well, what's the difference? How difficult is it? Can you learn bass just by knowing cello, or is it a completely different thing? Okay, so the short answer is you can't just know how to play bass just because you know how to play cello. It's tuned in fourths instead of fifths, and none of the strings are the same, except for one, which we'll get to in a moment. But I think it is interesting to talk about some of these differences, especially because as a cellist, if you ever want to pluck like a bass player, you certainly can do that. And there's lots of great bass players that we can emulate as cellists if you want to go into any arena where you want to do that. So first things first is it's not that crazy to think that the cello and bass are connected. The cello's lowest note is this C, the C 2 octaves below the middle C. This is called middle C just unilaterally. If you put it on a staff, it's of the grand staff, it's right in the middle. So it's middle C. And the lowest note of a bass that doesn't have one of their extension thingies is only 6 diatonic notes lower, E. So basically, the octave below this E is the low bass E. So with a difference of only 6 notes, there's actually a lot of overlap of the range. And in fact, the top bass string, which is G, is the same G in terms of which octave you're in as the cello open G string. So then the cello basically also has these 2 additional strings and then can't go as low. Okay. What else might be different about the double bass than the cello? Well, another really big difference, of course, is that it's much, much bigger. So you have to stand with it or use a stool where you're very upright with it. And while there's a French bow hold, which is very similar to the cello bow hold, most bass players use a German bow where they hold it basically like this, and it's a completely different shape that supports that. That's how they can get these really big up bow swells. So the thing about the bass, it's called the string bass. It's also called the double bass. If you've ever heard that term and kind of wondered, okay, well, is that because it's double the size of, what was it the double bass? Well, actually, it's the double bass because it doubles the cello. Back in Baroque times, there wasn't a bass, and the cello was the bass. And they read bass clef. When orchestras came along and the sound got bigger, composers needed a way to match the tonal quality of some of these new woodwind instruments, and they just needed a way to get more low end. So the double bass is the instrument that came along to double the normal bass of the cello. So in that way, they're definitely very related. In a lot of classical symphonies, the cello and bass part are the same, but the bass is sounding pitches an octave lower than what's written. Okay, so that's the main thing about the bass actually, is just the tone. It's a much beefier tone. It's much more difficult to get a melody out on it, although there are some incredible bass players nowadays that can do just unbelievable things with melody. The intervals are spaced apart so much more because it's bigger. So on cello where we do, open 1, 3, 4, bass players are basically doing open 1, 4, and then the next open already, because they're, again, only in fourths, not fifths. A fun fact is actually that the note names of the bass, even though they're completely different octaves, are the reverse of what a violin's is. E, D, G. Wait. E, A, D, G. But a violin's goes E, A, D, G. So, a couple of fun notes about cello and bass, because I think we've kind of summed up what the main differences are between the instruments and why, you would use one versus the other, and also that unfortunately they're not that translatable. But I just want to talk about one of the things, other than compositional, theory, that does relate the cello and the bass, and that's the way that we can pluck the strings. So a bass player will typically try to get as much of the flesh of the finger on the string as possible. You can hear that sound compared to just plucking with the tip of your finger is much fatter and warmer. So if you ever want a big, fat, warm sound, look to the bass players. And the key to doing this without it snapping is you have to think that you want the string to vibrate. Excuse me, that's nothing bad. In the same direction as the fingerboard. So in this case on the bass end, the fingerboard's kind of angled like this. So you want to pull the string along that direction so it doesn't snap in and buzz against the fingerboard. So that's the trick to doing that. The other thing you might get from bass players is what's called walking bass lines. And this can be a really great way of practicing how chords can relate to each other as we start working on all of that. None of this is meant to be overbearing, of course. But if you want to sounds pretty fine on cello to me. And if you're doing an ensemble with a flute player or something lighter, just knowing how to do that skill can be really important as a cellist because it sounds pretty good. It's not as fat as a bass, but it sounds pretty good. So, in summary, the cello is smaller. It's more of a melodic instrument, but originally it was the bass instrument in Baroque times. Then they came along and added the double bass for orchestras, and this upright string bass, which has the strings reversed from a violin in fourths, is a much more unwieldy instrument to play, different fingerings, different skill set with the bow, but it does carry a very intrinsic relationship with the cello, being the double bass, being the other bass, and really just having, at this point, a literature of its own. The bass has really come a long way because of a lot of really fantastic people. And that concludes our video. Thank you so much for watching. Again, I'm Justin Leopard. You can check out my playing at Justin Leopard Cello. This has been a production with Consordini.com. We wish you the best of luck with your cello, and we'll see you in the next video for another lesson.